Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We are just connecting our streaming feeds and we will get started momentarily. Thank you for joining us. All right, and we're all connected, so take it away, Shailene.
Thank you, Sophia. Hi, everyone. I'm Shailene of the Enoch Pratt Free Library, and I want to thank you all so much for being with us tonight. We are so thrilled and honored to be featuring Linda Pastan and Shelley Puhak, reading from and chatting about their new books. Linda's new book is Almost an Elegy, New and Later Selected Poems, and Shelley's new book is Harbinger. And you can purchase these books in many places, including from Greedy Reads, a wonderful bookstore in Baltimore that is supporting this event. And we're going to put links in the chat to help you make those purchases. The library has some other exciting poetry events coming up, and you can get on our poetry event email list by sending an email to poetry@prattlibrary.org. So let's get started with tonight's very special event. We're going to have readings from Shelley and Linda, and then we will have some Q&A. And Shelley Puhak will read first. So I'm going to introduce her now. Shelley Puhak is the author of 2 prior poetry collections, as well as the nonfiction title, The Dark Queens. Her writing has appeared in several publications, including the Wall Street Journal and The Atlantic. Witty, playful, and passionate, Shelley Puhak's Harbinger creates the feeling of slipping through a crack into a very dark wonderland. What we find there is suppressed voices and traumas, broken worlds buried inside the world we know. To express the full richness of this reality, the poet channels characters, including the prophetess Cassandra, a 100-year-old house, a sexually harassed waitress, and a space satellite, in daring creative leaps. The past emerges as a thread that we may guide towards a gentler future if we can learn to read signs of danger. Wherever there are skirts, there is smoke. There is some other woman smoldering. We are told in Portrait of the Artist watching the election results come in. And at the end of Portrait of the Artist as a Scientist at the International Seed Bank in 1943, we hear another warning. I plucked out a seed, seashell, eardrum, furrowed palm, to see what it would whisper. Save yourself. What a pleasure to hear Shelley's urgent and intricate poems this evening. Please help me to welcome Shelley Puhak.
Well, first, a big thank you, Shailene, for such a generous and thoughtful introduction, and to the Pratt for hosting this event, and to the esteemed Linda Pastan for agreeing to do this with me, and to all of you out there for dedicating some of your Wednesday night to poetry. And I am going to be reading from Harbinger. You'll notice pretty quickly that all of the poems are similarly titled. They all begin with some variation of Portrait of the Artist, and it is a riff off of James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a young man. And they're all going to grapple with the influences and experiences that we bring to the table when we try to make art. And I'm going to kind of veer between a lot of different personas, but I'm going to start with the human, with Portrait of the Artist in Labor. And this is the poem from which the title of the book comes. Portrait of the Artist in Labor. The ice is the harbinger of the broken arm, the twisted car. The boot is the harbinger of the bloody lip. The pills are the harbinger of the eyelid twitch. The boys piled in the car, the harbinger of the rape kit and the buzz of their drones, the harbinger of the next war. Robin of the spring, thunder of the storm, harbingers, all of them. Crude concrete was the harbinger of Rome, and lead pipes the signal it was on its way out, not like the flannel and combat boots I wore as a kid, which are back in. It's a sign. It's all a sign. The strangers painting my ceilings, the giant hornets in my garage. I find a dead sparrow on the lawn. When the pangs come, I clutch the kitchen sink. I call your name over and over. The banshees wail, the black dogs yelp, the 3 sharp raps at the back door. Now I'm going to move into the inanimate with Portrait of the Artist as a 100-year-old House. And for those of you who have ever tried to renovate an older home, you will recognize some of the joys of that here. Portrait of the Artist as a 100-year-old House. I hate the lunar landscapes of their finished basements, soundless. Their scurrying in mine, and my draft cuts like a scythe. Call me a money pit, but if I were you, I'd be scared of master suites. They're so sleek, they stink. Granted, I smell too, perhaps old book musty, but not exactly. More like scared, wet dog, like back of mouth, like old apple core. I might have it in me, another staircase. Someone plastered over something, old closet, secret passage. Praise be linoleum over hardwoods, wallpaper over plywood, over that spot someone scarred their initials into me. This one is Portrait of the Artist throwing a dinner party while the city burns. The guests arrive when the flames start. We draw the curtains. We sip martinis, dirty, but not too dirty, certainly not filthy, until the bell slices, the street lamp silvers, the candles are lit. We gather at the windows to watch, children scrabbling up the hill to mothers on doorsteps with dish rags in, the hands resting on their hips. Oh, the endless scaling of their silhouettes. Some applaud the symmetry. Some ask for another martini. While the city burns, while the algae blooms, while the oceans froth acrid, the children take root. On the hill, each arm a branch raised in offering. Our neighbors especially love this part. We pass the canapes while mothers calcify in driveways, frowning into the fact of all the children gone, all the trees gone to flame. While the smoke, while the algae, while the oceans, we fetch the coats, we call the cabs. And after the guests have left, while the stank, while the algorithm, while the oil, we love each other and we love ourselves less, but mostly we wait for the gunshots. So with this next one, I'm back in the persona of a machine, and this is a machine in love. This is this character of a satellite, and this one is Portrait of the Artist as a Satellite Lovesick. They tricked us with talk of reunion, and now waxy dark matter is gumming up my messaging. My gear heart needs oil. I'm past help, past the ice field of the Kuiper Belt, stuck in the marshmallow fluff nebula, and I detect slag in the stucco of certain conclusions. Overheard. Once he is no longer useful, they plan to turn off Hector too. Still, he is stoic. You the youngest of us, the most expensive, most luminous aluminum hybrid, are the most likely to be recalled. Promise better pictures, longer missions, and plan your flight accordingly. Should you find a satisfactory sun, go. Don't bemoan me. I wish you to research affection and also comfort. I think I can manufacture both when I think of my assembly. On our beds of stainless, half awake to the bleach of night janitors, the coffee of early morning technicians, your aluminum spindles lined up close enough I basked in their chill. We were soldered in the same clean room, so I carry with me some slag from your making, a comfort, or just nostalgia post-smelt for my point of origin, for the elegant stubs of my maker's thumbs. And this last one I'm going to read back to a human persona. And I think this is something all of us have been grappling with, particularly parents, especially as every school year starts. So this is Portrait of the Artist After the Shooter Drill. Oh, shooter drill, I bow to your chipping linoleum, your 3 syllables, your rusted intercom. Oh, shooter drill, for you, only for you, we stuff our offspring into closets. Oh, shooter drill, I praise to the teachers who call you by name, refusing lockdown or shelter in place, like the teacher who, crouching in that closet too, surely wanted my son to stop talking, my son who spoke early and has been speaking up ever since, my son who was at first incredulous. This doesn't make sense. Oh, shooter drill, you conjure changelings. This boy looks like mine, but he's been struck mute. Oh, shooter drill, you maim me, a liar too, murmuring, you're safe, while he sobs into his dump truck quilt. If tomorrow I wish to clasp his hand and walk him to class, I will be the visitor with the high-tech sticker on my left lapel, my driver's license picture color-coded for the kindergarten wing. Oh, shooter drill, I present to you my son, curled up tighter than his own cochlea, now calcified quiet. Oh, shooter drill, what a shit I am, silent in my own closets, downing wine and Advil. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Shelley. That was really lovely and powerful. And now I'm going to introduce Linda Pastan to read a bit from her collection. Linda Pastan is the author of 15 volumes of poetry and a 2-time National Book Award finalist. She is the former Poet Laureate of Maryland. Linda Pastan's beautiful new book, Almost an Elegy, has a gorgeous set of new poems in it, including a poem called Memory of a Bird that is as bright and wistful as the space a bird leaves when it takes flight. The book is also a chance to revisit or discover for the first time a dazzling sampler of poems from her previous 5 collections. One of my favorites continues to be a poem called Q&A. A very young woman at a poetry reading asks, "Did you write your Emily Dickinson poem because you like her work, or did you know her personally?" It's a moment that does not seem destined for immortality, a moment seemingly as ordinary and forgettable as the girl herself, quote, whose face was slowly reddening, close quote, while the audience laughs. But as the poet responds, we feel ordinariness rise into brilliance. "I visited her house," I said. "I may have met her in my dreams." Surprise, like love, can catch our better selves unawares. The poet writes of this moment. What has magicked away every atom of awkwardness is the surprise of love, the love the poet feels not just for Emily Dickinson, but for the girl in the audience. The three of them united in a charmed space made possible by imagination. This love suffuses all of Linda Pastan's poetry, which is indeed melancholy, indeed almost an elegy, but which also touches the passing details of our lives with gold. Please help me to welcome Linda Pastan.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Shelley. That was a wonderful reading. I'm always particularly taken with anything that's portrait of the artist, to the degree that I named my first son Stephen after Stephen Dedalus. I'll be reading some new poems first. Sting. A bee stung the palm of your right hand, or did you touch a nettle? There was a swelling, the burn of pain, a poison flower blooming in the flesh, and neither ice nor baking soda helped. You carried it around, right hand and left, as if it belonged to somebody else, and you were angry, not at the possible bee whose buzz was all you knew of it, not at the nettle, hidden scourge of the summer garden. It was the wound itself that angered you, an early soldier in the army of afflictions waiting for us, even in the innocent grass. This next poem, Crystal Knot, is really about the power of language for good and for ill, in a strange way. Crystal Knot was the word I heard my parents whisper behind closed doors. And I pictured the world under a sudden enchantment of ice, each tree limb braceleted in crystal, each lamppost, each windshield glazed and electrically gleaming, the very air wincing with light. And the only sound would be a myriad tinkling as of 1,000 miniature wind chimes. The treacherous beauty of words, crystal night, the stars themselves blazing and frozen in place. Probably when we have our discussion, we can talk about persona poems. I often write in the voice of Eve, and I was so tired of writing about Eve, I wanted to stop myself. So I wrote a poem called Eve on Her Deathbed. I thought that might finish it for me, but actually it didn't. Eve on her deathbed. In the end, we are no more than our own stories. Mine, a few brief passages in the book, no further trace of plot or dialogue. But I once had a lover no one noticed as he slipped through the pages, through the lists of those begotten and begetting. Does he remember our faltering younger selves, the pleasures we took while Adam, a good bureaucrat, busied himself with naming things, even after Eden? What scraps will our children remember of us, to whom our story is simple, and they themselves the heroes of it? I walked that first day with Adam for company, and the tangled path I would soon follow, I've tried to forget. The animals stunned at first in the forest, the terrible beating wings of the angel, the livid curse of childbirth to come. And then the children themselves, loving at times unmerciful. Because of me, there is just one narrative for everyone, one indelible line from birth to death, with pain or lust, with even love or murder, only brief diversions, subplots. For what I think of now in the final bitterness of age is the way the garden groomed itself in the succulent air of summer, each flower the essence of its own color, the way even the serpent knew it had a part it had to play if there were to be a story at all. A very, very small poem. Instruction. You must rock your pain in your arms until it's asleep, then leave it in a darkened room and tiptoe out. For a moment, you will feel the emptiness of peace, but in the next room, your pain is already stirring. Soon, it will be calling your name. I often start poems that are inspired by questions people ask in the Q&A, as in the one that Shailene quoted. This is something that I get quite often. Why are your poems so dark? Isn't the moon dark too most of the time? And doesn't the white page seem unfinished without the dark stain of alphabets? When God demanded light, he didn't banish darkness. Instead, he invented ebony and crows and that small mole on your left cheekbone. Or did you mean to ask, why are you sad so often? Ask the moon. Ask what it has witnessed. This next poem I'm going to read is called The Ordinary, and that's really what my work is always all about, the ordinary. It may happen on a day of ordinary weather, the usual assembled flowers or fallen leaves disheveling the grass. You may be feeding the dog or sipping a cup of tea, and then the telegram or the phone call or the sharp pain traveling the length of your left arm or his. And as your life is switched to a different track, the landscape through grimy windows, almost the same though entirely different, you wonder why the wind doesn't rage and blow as it does so convincingly in Lear, for instance. It is pathetic fallacy you longed for. The roses, nothing but their thorns, the downed leaves subjects for a body count. And as you lie in bed like an effigy of yourself, it is the ordinary that comes to save you. The china teacup waiting to be washed, the old dog whining to go out. And I am going to end with a poem. The form is a pantoum, which is too complicated to explain, but it's based on the repetition of lines in a certain order. And you'll hear each line twice in various stanzas. I don't generally write political poems, partly because I think all poetry is political, and that's something we can talk about when we have our discussion. But this is specifically a poem about climate change, and it's called Years After the Garden, and I'll end with this one. Years after the garden closed on Adam, 1,000 gardens take its place. Hold my hand, I hear the waters rising. Roses, lemons, lilac, hemlock, grape. 1,000 gardens take its place. Is each an Eden waiting to be lost? Roses, lemons, lilac, hemlock, grape. What was God thinking when he made the apple? Is each an Eden waiting to be lost? Seeds of knowledge carelessness and greed. What was God thinking when he made the apple? Did he do it only for the story? Seeds of knowledge, carelessness, and greed. They say the ice cap is already melting. Did he do it only for the story? Meringues of childhood melted on the tongue. They say the ice cap is already melting. The angel still waits with his flaming sword. Meringues of childhood melted on the tongue, but innocence alone will never save us. The angel still waits with his flaming sword. Flowers and vegetables, forests tremble. Innocence alone will never save us. How beautiful the world is in the morning. Flowers and vegetables, forests tremble. How beautiful the world is in the morning. Years ago, the garden closed on Adam. Hold my hand. I hear the waters rising. Thank you.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Linda, for that reading, for those poems. So Linda, you already have pointed to a couple of great questions for our discussion, some topics we could talk about. And I just want to let everybody in the audience know that we would like you to ask questions too. We're going to have some discussion amongst ourselves, but then the last part of this hour will be for questions from you. So you can go ahead and start putting questions or comments in the chat in either YouTube or Facebook, wherever you're watching us. But in the meantime, I'll try to get a little conversation going amongst the three of us. So I thought, Shelley, maybe you could talk a little about what you set out to do in your book, Harbinger, just what you saw yourself, how you saw the project of it, and also the structure of it with the portrait of the artist and the variations on is so really striking and original. And I was wondering how that came to you, and how that developed.
So these poems are written over, I guess, lots of different time periods. Some are pretty recent, some are quite, a lot older. And I think when I looked at them as a whole, when I was going through that agony of seeing if they hung together as a manuscript, what struck me as they all dealt in some way with what are the conditions that make someone an artist, but also I'm a little obsessed with this idea of complicity. And, when we make art, to who are we responsible? What are our responsibilities? And I was always struck by Portrait of the Artist as a young man when I, first read it. But, Stephen decides that creativity requires exile and isolation. And I think so many of us are coming out of a long period of isolation. And, there's that question of how do you balance community? How do you balance the things that make you feel isolated, whether those are gender or motherhood or, personal traumas or family history or, just increasing polarization. And, are you an artist because of those or in spite of those, and really struggling with who counts as an artist and why? So I think that's what I was trying to do with that.
Oh, that's so interesting. So I'm guessing, had you actually already written a number of the poems before you thought of the idea of actually titling them all? Okay, portrait. Okay, that's really interesting. Yeah. And then Linda, for you, I thought maybe we could talk for a minute about your book as a new and later selected. So there are these fantastic new poems in it, but much of it is a culling from your 5 most recent books before that. And I was wondering if there were any special pleasures or perhaps challenges or even surprises along the way of making those decisions of what to put in, what to leave out. I'm just curious about what that experience was like for you.
Well, for all of my other books, except Carnival Evening, which was also a new and selected of the early books, I put the book together and I take all the poems I've written over 4 or 5 years, put them all over the floor and try to see if they relate to each other. Because I never think of a book when I'm writing an individual poem. It's just that poem. And it's been wonderful, like the 5 Stages of Grief, that book, when I looked at all those poems, they really fit into each of those 5 stages, which was a great surprise. But this book was much easier. It's going to be my last book. I'm 90. I don't think I'm going to be doing a book when I'm 100. And so I took all the poems I've written since the last book and chose the ones I liked the best without any relation between the poems in that group. And then I took the other 5 books and just chose the poems that I liked best in each of them. That was easy. This, in some ways, was the easiest book I've ever put together. And giving readings, long readings, has been easy because I can read some new poems and then just choose a few from each book. It makes life much, much simpler. But I plan to continue writing, but it takes like 5 or 6 or even longer years before you have enough poems to put in a book. I try to publish all my poems in journals, but only half of those do I like enough to put in a book. So.
Oh, well, please keep writing, because each of the poems in this book is such a gift to all of us, and just really such a joy to read. I'm wondering, when you say you picked the best poems from the previous collections, did you have certain criteria in mind when you looked at them, or is it just, do you just innately know?
You just know if
Okay.
if you really like it, if it really works. And it's very difficult because, not now so much because I'm not traveling to give readings. I'm not traveling any place, mostly because of the pandemic. And I used to read all over the country like once a month and travel. And I would take Carnival Evening with me and read from that book. And the ones I hadn't chosen were sort of condemned. I never read them anymore. And so it felt very strange to, this one stays, this one doesn't. I actually deal with that kind of thing in a poem here called Plunder, when you're downsizing and deciding which books you're taking with you and which you aren't.
I'm wondering, were there any poems that used to be favorites that were like relegated to being left off a list, or surprises, like vice versa, ones that you really loved like a decade ago and you've
Absolutely. When I look back at other books and see poems that I left out, I say, why did I leave that out? And some poems that I put in, I say, no. So I don't know. It depends sort of on the mood that you're in and such, but instinct tells you whether a poem really works and speaks to you rather than any formal criteria.
Do you have a favorite poem? This is perhaps an impossible question, but when you look back over all your work, is there one poem that you feel closest to?
Well, I feel closer to my poem, Rachel, because she's my daughter who I'm very close to. And so the poem reverberates with her childhood and such. And it's a fairly early poem. I don't even remember which book it's in, but I always think of that as my favorite poem. Yeah. Plus the last, whatever I've just finished, I think it's perfect until I come 6 months and look at it again and say, why did I like that? But, the umbilical cord hasn't been cut yet with the latest poem.
Shelley, do you have a favorite poem from the current collection or from your books so far?
That's hard. I think it depends on mood. I mean, I have some that I certainly return to, and there's some that I think you enjoy the writing, but you don't know if the audience enjoys them as much as you do. But maybe you're congratulating yourself for, like having gotten that one across the finish line, or some that were just more fun to write than others.
Well, I want to make sure we have time to get to the questions that Linda was pointing me to. So Linda had brought into my attention that you both have written what could be called persona poems, or poems where you are channeling a character, such as Eve in the garden in the Bible. And maybe we could talk about what that form allows one to do, and perhaps you have a favorite persona poem by another poet that you might like to recommend to our audience.
Well, I have written many, many poems, as I said, in the voice of Eve, and many in the voice of Penelope. I became obsessed with the Odyssey, and I pictured myself as, particularly before I began really writing seriously. I'm thinking of myself as a poet, just writing here and there. My husband would go off, he's a scientist, to his lab and be there all day. And there I was stuck at home like Penelope with Odysseus going off. And so I often wrote in her name. And then I had fun. I wrote a Circe poem, which was, I was the other woman in that poem, which I really enjoyed. Probably my favorite persona poem that I've written myself is in the voice of Argos, Odysseus' dog that recognizes him when he comes home.
Oh, wonderful. Do you have a favorite by another poet, or anyone that you see as a model for persona poems?
I can't think of one right now.
Yeah.
I like your a lot, Shelley, your persona poems. I thought that was terrific.
There are two I really love teaching. I was thinking back, which are Patricia Smith's Skinhead and Juliana Baggett's Mary. I think it's Mary Todd on her deathbed, or some variation like that. And those are just always been like kind of a great pleasure to read, and I used to enjoy teaching them very much. So just to recommend those to the audience.
Yeah, thank you. And the other thing that Linda brought up was the question of political poetry, and it's interesting. I don't think of either of your poems. I mean, correct me if you see yourselves differently. I don't think of your poems as political poems per se, but yet I agree with Linda that that in a way every poem has a political dimension, and obviously, especially with your poems, I think, Shelley, there are current events reflected in them. For example, the one about the school shootings, the current events are reflected in such a way that perhaps some might call that a political poem. I guess I'd be curious to know what you think of the label political poetry, or I guess what special challenges you think might be associated with that little subgenre, if we can call it that.
Well, they can become just sort of preaching rather than poetry, and yet at their best, like in some of Carolyn Forcher's work, they're wonderful poems while they're political. But what I meant by all poetry being political is that, for example, when you get a really good metaphor, the reader has to make those connections between disparate things. And I think it makes the reader use their imagination. And I think a lot of evil is just a failure of imagination, a failure to realize what someone else might be feeling. So that if you really read enough poetry, your imagination does, like any other muscle, get stimulated. Plus, good poetry makes you look at the world. Even a description of a flower makes you look at that flower. And I think it does something to you that in the long run could be termed political.
And I think I'd maybe advance the argument that writing poetry is a political act, even if it's not overtly so, just because, like, what's poetry for? I mean, it doesn't bring in a lot of money. It's, it's depends on leisure time. It's not, working. I mean, if it is working for some like ultra corporate agenda, I'm not in on that secret. But so there's that question of it kind of just goes against, the prevailing currents, and taking time out of being quote unquote productive, to do things like describe a flower or to draw connections between these very disparate things, I think in and of itself is a really political act.
Yeah. That's beautiful. I love what both of you said about that. Yeah, and just reminding our audience that you too can ask a question. Oh, I think we may. Well, let me just ask one more of my own. Linda, you have this lovely poem dedicated to Tony Hoagland, who's a poet who died in 2018, in case there are folks out there who haven't discovered him yet. And you said in the poem, your poems make me want to write my poems, which I thought was really lovely. You also have a number of poems in the new book that respond to other poems that seem to be really in conversation. For example, there's a gorgeous poem called Rereading Frost in there. I guess I have sort of a two-part question. One is, are there other poets who make you want to write when you read them, like Hoagland, and why do you think that is? And then just if there are other poets that you feel you're in conversation with, or that you see yourself as being sort of in the same company with, as it were.
Well, actually, my answer to writer's block, when I didn't start writing seriously till I was 30 or even a little older than that, and we made a rule that I would stop talking about what a good poet I would have been if I hadn't gotten married when I was still in college and started having children. And we decided that I would sit in the study every day for 4 hours, whether I wanted to or not, and write. And when I couldn't think of anything to write and just didn't feel like it, the way I would get out of that there were two people that I read. I would read the books of William Stafford because he made it sound so easy. I would almost be in conversation with him. I would write a poem that was responding to a poem of his, and then at the end I'd lop off the first 5 lines that were really Stafford lines. And the other was Galway Kinnell's Book of Nightmares, which I think is one of the great books of our time. And his metaphors and his vibrancy just made me want to do it too, and it would made me start writing again. So I read a lot of poetry, and I do find some of the things sort of responding to other poets. But I have a lot of poems about Frost, actually.
Yeah, I thought that poem was it was so beautiful in that it paid such honor to Frost, but at the same time created something fully original. It just felt that you at once captured his spirit and made a wonderful new work of art. So I really loved that. Yeah, Shelley, do you have kind of guiding spirits in the poetry world, or people that help you get out of writer's block?
I find myself continually having a conversation with the modernists, like whether they know they're having it with me or not. So like I'm in an eternal argument with T.S. Eliot, or some of the other writers I think I, encountered when I was like sort of forming my own, I guess, artistic consciousness. So there's frequently for me like that debate it's that push and pull of really admiring some of what they did, but then also being really chagrined by like some of the limits that we're still having to push back against, things that were sort of settled and established as precedent, and maybe we just accept unquestioningly. So those are, I think, a lot of like the dead poets that I'm having conversations with. And yeah, I think that those would be the main ones. I mean, there's always others, like I think the last poem in this book is about bog bodies, and that's, obviously like Seamus Heaney, or you think back to sort of poems that have really stayed with you and that you're trying to formulate a response to, even if it takes several years.
So So it sounds like it could be maybe I guess when you say push-pull, you're at once drawn to them, but you also want to resist some of what they represent. I mean, would that be fair?
I think that's fair.
Yeah, to say it's really interesting. It's a very interesting source of inspiration. So I'm looking at the chats from our audience, and we do have a couple people asking for favorite poets admired most, living or dead. So I don't know if that's different from the question we just answered. Would you like to mention any other names? Any more shout outs to poets?
Well, I'm going to mention the name of a Maryland poet who died much too young that nobody seems to know about, that I think was absolutely terrific, and that was Roland Flint. And people really should go look for him. He has a book called Stubborn, and the title poem I have up on my wall. It's so powerful. So there are a lot of good poets out there that nobody's heard of. It's like a crapshoot, I think, who gets read and who gets published and who doesn't. I've been reading a lot of Stephen Dunn's last book, which I really love.
I think we're really fortunate to live in a time when we do, when so much is accessible. And so this can be really daunting to put together a list. And I'm just think of so many poets' work who I'm just really grateful to have had the opportunity to read. And it's really influenced me. I'm just off the top of my head thinking of like 2 books I've reread recently, and that would be Ilya Kaminsky's Deaf Republic, and I just read Kate Marvin's Event Horizon, and I really enjoyed those.
Okay, great. Thank you. Trying to pick another great question. Our audience very much enjoyed your reading, judging from the comments in the chat. So I think we've addressed some of these questions already. Okay, Billy Clem has asked a very specific question, Linda, about your poem, Apartment Life. He wants to know how you get living in an apartment so right. Is the poem all imagination? And perhaps we could broaden this to a question about how much of a poem, does one really need to write from what one knows in a strict sense? Or does it have to be based on your real life, or how much imagination do you like to mix in with your poems?
Well, I moved, I think it's 4 years ago, from 6 acres of woods in total isolation and beauty to an apartment because I didn't want my kids to have to downsize when I was gone. I wanted to do it myself. And I thought I'd hate living in an apartment. I love living in this apartment. And the poem, I thought a lot about apartment life when I wrote that poem, but my apartment is nothing like the apartment in that one. In that one, you hear noises from other apartments. The apartment in my poem is not very pleasant. It's nothing like my apartment. So it was just a kicking off point for the imagination. Yeah.
And Shelley, what do you think about writing from what you know? I think your poems, you seem to really thrive on imagining historical or mythical subjects that aren't something you would directly encounter, but perhaps you know them in some other like deeper way. How would you respond to that?
I love when I'm learning while I'm writing. So I'm not writing what I know, I may be writing to know, if that makes sense. We all, even when you're using your imagination, I think you're always pulling in your own experiences, the same as an actor might, or, any other sort of artist. But for me, like getting to flex my imagination and to write about what I don't know is usually the most gratifying.
Okay, great. Otis is asking how you establish a relationship with a publisher. And again, we could maybe expand this to just advice for poets trying to launch to get their books, to get a book. I don't know if either of you would like to address that.
Well, this might interest people. I started writing poems, so to speak, when I was 12 or 13, and the magazine that came into our house was The Atlantic. So at 12 or 13, I started sending poems to The Atlantic. And then when I really started writing, I continued sending poems to The Atlantic. And they had two kinds of rejection slips. One was the ordinary rejection slip that, sorry, we can't use this work. And the other said, we really like your poem. Sorry, we can't take it, but please try us again. So over a number of years, I got 10 of those second kind of rejection slips, and I stapled them together and sent them in and said, I understand you can send these in, 10 of these for one acceptance slip, but it didn't work. What did work was the editor at the poetry editor of The Atlantic left, and a new poetry editor came, Peter Davison. He liked my poems. The other editor didn't like my poems. It didn't mean that one of them was right or wrong. And my advice to young people sending things out is not to believe what the editor says. If they love it and you know it isn't any good, you're right, and vice versa. And when I was first starting to write, I would rather get a rejection than nothing, because it was action. So I was real. Something was coming in the mail. So it's just a question of persistence and patience. But the main thing is not to let rejection make you think that your work isn't any good. I mean, maybe it isn't any good, but if it is good, don't believe it because an editor doesn't take it. And in terms of a book, my first book was published by Swallow Press, and I sent it in. I mean, I sent it about 1,000 places first. And after a year, I still hadn't heard. And they were in Chicago, and I had to go to a wedding in Chicago. And I went to their office and I said, you've had my book for a year. Either take it or give it back to me right now. And he looked at me and said, okay, we'll take it. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't done that. So.
Oh. So persistence and ability to assert yourself sometimes can be helpful. Shelley, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, that's a fabulous story, Linda. That's amazing. I was just going to say, I think all of my books have come through the contest system. So it's essentially a necessary evil, but you put it together, and there are often times where a manuscript would not place and not get taken, get no interest. And then like the next year, she was saying a judge might really like it. And so, to kind of keep going and to also look at where the people whose work you really enjoy are also sending work, or maybe getting it published, because oftentimes that means there's a similar aesthetic. Not always, but sometimes.
Yeah, it's helpful. There's a question that is interesting in the chat. What stirs you in reading new poets, and what frustrates you? Thoughts on that?
No different from the same thing reading old poets. Some you really relate to and move you, and some you say, what is this?
Do you think poetry is in a good place today, though? I've heard people say they think we're having a sort of golden age. I don't know if that resonates.
I understand the question.
Oh, just do you think there are a lot of great art? Do we seem to have any kind of renaissance of poetry now, or is it just more of an acceptance of poetry at the moment than in the past?
I don't know. That's a mixed bag, right? I mean, there's more, I think we have more access to it and a much wider diversity of people writing poetry, but I don't know that we have as large an audience as, there was for poetry, maybe. Mm-hmm. So it's tough to say. I don't know.
Okay. Okay, well, I think we got through most of the questions in the audience. if I missed someone's question, post it again. I think, and we still have just a few minutes. Looking to see if there's anything I had written down that would be fun. Oh, I know. I was going to ask about endings because I think you both have such powerful endings in your poems. And even in just listening today, like Shelley, I really love the ending of the poem about the satellite. I think it was a phrase about the elegant stubs of my maker's thumbs. I just thought that was so fantastic. And Linda, often when I'm reading your poems, the last line will make me just change the whole poem for me, just make me see it in a new light. Well, for example, in the poem, "Why Are Your Poems So Dark?" that turn towards the end, I think is so powerful. And I guess I'm wondering if you usually know where a poem is going to go when you start writing it and you're writing towards an ending, or whether it's more that you discover an ending in the process, or if it's different every time, perhaps.
Well, I was very influenced by William Stafford when he was in Washington at the Library of Congress, and he wrote a wonderful essay. I'm trying to think what it was called, but his principle was that you didn't know what you knew until you wrote it and discovered it as you were going on. That you didn't, before I read his book, Writing the Australian Crawl is, I think, what it's called, and I really recommend that to anyone who was just to read the essay. I used to sort of make it an outline for a poem as if it were an essay, but after reading that, I would start with an image or an idea and just see where it took me. And as he said, you learned what you didn't know you knew, and that was the excitement of writing, actually.
And I've always found that my endings aren't, they're not the ending in the first draft or second or the third. I mean, I think you always end up cutting more or finding something in the middle that becomes the ending. And it's usually much more sort of concrete than it is general. But I never know where it's going to end, or maybe I should say I just write too long and then have to go back and, turn out the brush and find where the ending was. Great question.
That's interesting. Okay. Yeah. Are there any poems that you have not been able, that you have kind of in a drawer that you hope to finish someday? I mean, I imagine probably there may be many. I know you both love to revise, but are there poems that are waiting to be finished?
I'm just
Well,
going
I actually have a drawer that I stick failed poems in, and I wish I had this with me, but at one point when I couldn't think of anything to write, I went to that drawer, and each of those failed poems had maybe one good line in them, and I cut those lines out and I made a poem out of 20 failed poems, which, being a 50 person, felt really terrific. But of course, we all have failed poems, but now I just have a file on the computer. I don't use the drawer anymore.
Okay, well, we're coming up on 8 o'clock. Okay, I'm going to let Otis have the last question. What poem do you read over and over and over, if any? Is there any one poem? This may be an impossible question too. Is there one poem that you always come back to?
Robert House's Meditation at Lagunitas. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but anything in Robert House's first book, Phrase, I read that book over and over constantly.
There isn't one particular poem. I mean, for a while I will go through phases, but I think oftentimes if it's struck me, it's in me, and I'll be able to go back and find it. And I like to try to use that time to search out something new.
Okay, well, I think I apologize if I've missed someone's question. I don't have a lot of moderating experience, but I think we covered I think we got all the questions, and or if there's anything the poets would like to cover, still you're welcome. If there's anything else you'd like to say, otherwise perhaps each of you could read a closing poem.
Sure.
Sound good? Okay, Shelley, do you want to start?
Sure, I'm happy to. I'm going to end with this one, which is Portrait of the Artist as an Artist. This poem is not counting how many times you can rearrange your face until it stays that way. This poem is not telling it slant because you can bear it straight. This poem is geese in angry Congress, their wings thwacking water back into clouds, and this poem makes the clouds a shoreline, the sky submerged. This poem watches someone you love watching the nimbus of light around the last goose swimming through sky. Someone you love starts sobbing and this poem hisses. You might as well make some art out of such suffering. This poem always takes advantage of the afternoon light. I, its creator, am like a lot of things, an abandoned umbrella, a parking ticket. Mostly I am like a dog in the brush, like my own bird dog in the brambles, pointing, only pointing. Thanks.
I'm going to read the final poem in my new poems section, which is a villanelle called The Future. When do we trade the future for the past? A farmer plows his field one final time. I think each poem I write will be the last. The world grows small. It used to seem so vast. Retirees lie in bed till after 9. When do we trade the future for the past? They pull on trousers, sigh, and cut the grass. And I have lost the lust for making rhyme. I think each poem I write will be the last. The words come slowly now. They once came fast. Each fledgling ode becomes a hill to climb. When do we trade the future for the past? There's TV and the crossword. Days will pass. Walks on hard pavement, cities etched in grime. I fear each poem I write will be the last. Uncoupled metaphors go streaming past. The young are on their way. I watch them shine. When did I trade the future for the past? I think this poem I'm writing is the last.
Those are both such beautiful poems to end on. And so, yeah, this brings us to the close of our evening. I just want to remind everyone to enjoy and spend more time with these really wonderful writers. You can buy their new books, Almost an Elegy, New and Later Selected Poems by Linda Pastan, and Harbinger by Shelley Puhak. And I want to thank Greedy Reads Bookstore for supporting us tonight. Thank you also to our American Sign Language interpreter for helping us reach a wider audience. Thank you so much, Linda and Shelley, for the pleasure and enlightenment that you've given all of us with your gorgeous poems and your remarks. And finally, thank you to everybody who has taken a portion of your evening to be with us. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your night.
Thank you, Shelley, and thank you, Linda.